do the chat between ourselves.
Okay.
It won't be on the live stream. And we will again be getting the questions from the Slack, and I will be fielding those, so you won't need to worry about that at all. And let me just double check another thing with Alex, because when I switch to the Slack to look at the questions, I want to make sure that I'm not switching what everyone else is seeing. So I'll be back in a minute. Okay, ready?
So Matt,
Yeah.
Chloe is sitting next to me. She's one of the RTI contacts, and she is on her computer logged in like a participant view. And just so you know, she can see all the chat.
She can see the chat.
Yeah.
Oh, but yeah, okay. That's okay, because the only people who have the URL are us and Alex and whoever else that's okay. Gave the URL to. So we've been encouraging Alex?
That works? Okay.
Alex?
I did not hear it. That works? Okay.
Alex?
I did not hear it.
Last questions before we go. So I think that also served as a good mic. So I will also be sure to phone when you all are speaking, and we are now live. So let's give everyone a minute to settle in, and then we'll begin momentarily. If you're tuning into the live stream now, please know that we'll be taking questions on the Slack in the speaker questions channel. So if you have any questions, you can go ahead and start putting your questions in there, and we'll get started with the panel in about 1 minute. Welcome. Can we do a mic check?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep. All right, good. We're live. So
Cool.
we're about to get started. Chris, we will be able to communicate with each other through the Slack channel that we've set up for the speakers.
Okay.
All right, everyone ready to go? All right.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you all for tuning in. On behalf of the Russell Sage Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and Princeton University, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the Summer Institutes in Computational Social Science. We're very excited to have a panel on job market and computational social science. And we're particularly excited that we have such a great group of panelists here from all of the participating sites all around the world. So each of the participants will have a chance to introduce himself or herself in a moment. But let me just briefly welcome Mati Nalamarka, who is joining us from the site in Istanbul. Ridi Kaship, who is joining us from the SICSS site in Oxford. Karen Davis, who is joining us from the SICSS site at RTI, Research Triangle, North Carolina. And Chris Bale, who is joining us from the SICSS site in Boston. And I'm Matt Salganik, and I'm going to be moderating this discussion. I'm joining from the SICSS site in Princeton, and I will be also participating in the discussion as well. As a reminder, we'll be taking questions from people watching the live stream, and also so you can put those questions into the speaker questions channel on Slack. Also, this conversation will be recorded and stored in our YouTube archive. So this will we'll have a record of this, not just for the people who are watching it now, but for anyone that could potentially benefit from it in the future. Okay, so to give some background for the participants, I thought it would be helpful for each of the members of the panel to talk a little bit about their experience on the job market as a computational social science doing work in this area. So I've asked each of the panel members to talk for a minute about their experience, and then that can be helpful to people watching so that they can have a sense of the kinds of questions that they can ask, and also the kinds of perspectives that we will bring to our answers. This is a topic about which there is really no right answer. There are many different answers, and so you should know that our background and keep that in mind as we are answering the questions. So I'll go first just to give some sense of how, so I am a sociology professor at Princeton. I've been here for about 10 years. In addition to working at Princeton, I've done some sabbaticals inside of companies. So I did a sabbatical this year at the New York Times as a professor in residence. I've also done a sabbatical at Microsoft Research. in New York. And also before I went to graduate school, I worked for 2 years at the US Census Bureau. So I have some experience working in the government. I have some experience working in universities, and I have some experience working in companies that are interested in computational social science. So maybe now we can go around the panel, starting with Maddie, and each one of the panel members can give a little bit of sense of their work background. I will say all of my work background is limited to the United States, and so I'm very happy that we have participants from outside of the United States as well on the panel. So Maddie?
So I'm currently at the University of Helsinki in the Faculty of Social Sciences. And before moving into, so I moved there in March this year. And before that, I was in the computer science faculty at Aalto University doing my PhD and postdocs. And before that, I've been working actually in the industry. So I was at Nokia Research for a long time before doing my PhD studies and finishing everything from there. And on top of this sort of faculty job in social sciences, I'm actually consulting in a Finnish IT company related to social data science.
Great. Thank you, Maddie. Reedy, could you maybe talk a little bit about your work background in computational social science?
Sure. So, hi, I'm Reedy. I'm an associate professor of demography here at the University of Oxford, and I'm also a fellow at Nuffield College. So I should also say that I'm an associate junior professor in Oxford. We have assistant, associate, all collapsed in one category. This is now my second year in the job. Before I started this job, I was a postdoc also for 1 year. It was a brief stint as a postdoc at Oxford itself, at Nuffield College. And before that, I was a PhD student jointly between the University of Oxford and the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research, which is in Germany. So I spent about half of my time in Oxford, half of my time in Germany. I primarily, from a disciplinary perspective, identify as a demographer. So I'm very interested in questions about population science, but I'm housed in a department of sociology with a secondary affiliation in anthropology. Before I did my PhD, I've had short stints working for the UN. I've also worked as a research assistant in a school of public health at Harvard after I finished my undergraduate degree. So I guess I've had largely sort of research-based experiences also in settings outside of just academia.
Great, thank you, Reedy. Karen, maybe you could go next.
Hi, good afternoon. I work at RTI International. I've been here 20 years tomorrow. We are a nonprofit research institute. We do primarily, at least in the section that I work in, we do primarily US federal government research. I have a lot of different roles here. One is I'm the CIO for the Social, Statistical, and Environmental Sciences Business Group. I'm also the Vice President of RTI's Research Computing Division, where we are focused on employing technology and doing systems projects for our clients. So we are not the internally focused IT organization. I've had a lot of different roles at RTI. One of the other things I'm doing is I am the executive sponsor for our artificial intelligence, computational social science focused initiative, which is the one that's sponsoring the Summer Institute here at RTI. And before RTI, I worked at Data General, which is now actually part of Dell. It had been bought by EMC. I ran part of the Unix operating systems development organization, also worked in hardware engineering there, worked in manufacturing systems. I've also worked for 3 other good-sized companies, Colgate-Palmolive, Ford Motor Company, and Bethlehem Steel, which actually no longer exists. So I have a wide variety of background, none of which is academia, except for my, my education, of course. Thank you for including me today.
Thank you, Karen. And Chris?
Hey, everyone. I'm Chris Bale. I'm a professor of sociology and public policy at Duke. Before that, I was a professor of sociology at UNC Chapel Hill. And before that, I was a postdoc at the University of Michigan. And before grad school, I worked for the United Nations Development Program. Mostly I can offer insight on the social science job market, but also the kind of the intersection of the data science, computational social science, and social science market, having been on the hiring side of committees, both in sociology departments and in data science departments.
Great. Thank you all. So to start us off, I wonder if I could ask a pretty general question. So often people come to us asking us for advice about the job market. So what are some kind of general pieces of advice you offer to people who are asking you about finding a job, particularly related to computational social science? So I could go first. So one of the first things I often ask people is, what is it?
Want us to weigh in?
Yeah, you can just wade in whenever you're ready. One of the things that I often say is, what is it that you really want to be doing? So among graduate students, I think there's often a focus on working at a university, and I think that's great. I love working at universities. But I also think that in computational social science, we're very fortunate that there are many other places that we could work. We could work in nonprofits, we could work at tech companies, we could work in governments. So I try to encourage people before they get too narrow to thinking about like which particular opportunity do I want at which particular time, to take a step back and think about how do I want to be spending my time. And then once they've sort of answered that big question, then we go into more specific things about the sort of domain that they're most interested in. So for other members of the panel, are there kind of general pieces of advice that you find yourself giving over and over as people come to you to ask questions?
So there's a couple things that I find come up every time. You've mentioned the first one, which is thinking about what do you really want to do and what's important. Some people, there are tech companies that essentially will continue to offer big dollar jobs to people, and that, that is important. I mean, making a good living is important as well. But to some people, having a big stock option plan or something of that sort really matters. To other people, they want to be associated with an organization that is mission-based or is, improving the human condition, as we say at RTI, and understanding what matters and what's going to be a good fit is something that I advise each person to really think about. I think people who are getting out of school think about, I need to get a job. And I want to get a job doing doing this thing that I've learned to do. And they don't pay as much attention to, they're also choosing an employer, they're choosing a place, they spend a lot of hours every week. And so it's really important to think about what matters, what kind of fit. If you're a person who wants to do one thing and focus on it for a lot of hours, then you're not going to want to take a job where you've got to work on 5 projects at the same time. And those kinds of things. And I think students don't really think about that they have a choice. I think often they think about, well, I want to find somebody who'll hire me, which makes sense, but not at the exclusion of what's going to make, your job experience a positive one.
So, Matt, you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you, Maddie. This is our first time trying this format, and so that will be the first of many logistical mix-ups. So I wanted to say, if there, Maddie or Reedy or Chris, if you want to jump in, please feel free. Otherwise, we'll move to the questions that are coming in from the Slack channel. Any last thoughts on this topic?
So different countries have widely different setup on their academic career system, which is also something that I've weighed in quite a lot. So in Finland, for example, people tend to be in postdocs for actually several years before they apply for a more tenured position of professor or something like that, which is much different from the US kind of system. So that's also something that I'm waiting, like, do you really want to stay in that, like on the loop, on the postdoc loop for 4 or 5 years before you start applying? Because that's not nice from my own experiences as well. Or do you want to go to a job market easily? And also, like, do you really want to go? Or I try to say to everyone that one thing, as Karen spoke, in the industry job market is that they have different kind of maybe behaviors, like they don't always kick you in the head, which happens quite often in the academic system, especially due to the fact that we don't have early career positions in similar way that like other contexts or US has. So that's sort of the balancing that I'm saying, that you should go to industry and see how it feels. So just that you have a reference point to compare your experiences from the university, because many students come straight from the like master's and then they do the PhD and they don't have time to actually see industry positions, which I find sad.
So just let me ask a follow-up question about that, because I think that's a question that I often hear from students is, for graduate students in the US and also for graduate students to the extent that you all can speak about it in other countries, what is your sense of the best way for students to understand more about what opportunities are available outside of universities? This would include tech companies, but non-tech companies as well. Maddie, you mentioned internships. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that and what you see as the advantages of doing those and what you see as some of the drawbacks, and how someone who wanted to get an internship at a company would go about doing that.
If someone else wants to take, because there's actually someone, okay. So in terms of like looking for internship, stuff like that, I always find it better just to like scout out. I have lots of friends in the industry which make it easier. Like if I put a Facebook post that I'm looking for this kind of place or that kind of place, I'll get people contacting me that, okay, this is the position where we would want to hire you. For example, like the current gig in the software consulting company, I just wrote a Facebook post that I've been in university too long and I want to go back to industry like half time, well, 1 day per week, and I set up and you need to accept that I'll be for some time for trips and stuff like that, and I get invitations. And then we've sort of tried to set up some associations in Finland to help people to also mingle with companies more generally, like go and drink their free beer. This is also something that I think the computer scientists are really good in organizing. Maybe not the social scientists, but the computer scientists have this kind of, let's go to the companies, let's drink their beer, let's drink their sodas, let's go to their sauna, which is really Finnish kind of thing, and get a feeling of what kind of opportunities we have there and what they are doing. And at least at the moment, the sort of digitalization, computer sciencey stuff with application domains to social sciences, it's hiring like hell. Like everyone wants to get people like that, so it's not that hard to actually convince people that you should organize this.
So
Thank you, Maddie. Karen?
Some of the other things that that I recommend, that not everywhere necessarily has these kinds of things available, but for non-academia jobs, you know, certainly if there's specific organizations that a student is interested in, you know, Cisco, IBM, I mean, RTI. In the Research Triangle Park, we're a technology-focused area, so there's a lot of high-tech organizations here. And certainly, you know, websites, there's jobs. Some of the challenges are, of course, you're one of a million resumes. And so some of the things that they have in this area are events for young professionals, not just students necessarily, but things like us. There's a speed mentoring event that the Research Triangle Park has periodically, and it's an opportunity for students, young professionals, to essentially meet 30 or 40 professionals from organizations locally in one setting. And they're, you know, 10 or 20-minute segments, and you pick the people you want to talk to, et cetera. And and you can get around and talk to a lot of people and make contact. So for getting into industry, especially ones where the jobs are very competitive, finding contacts, networking in various ways so that you can narrow down the ones that might be interesting to you, and then find a way to connect with those people later on as jobs are open. Just applying on websites, so everyone has to do it to meet US hiring laws, but it's hard to stand out if you don't have somebody you know in that organization.
Thank you, Karen. Chris or Reedy, do you have any more thoughts on this topic before we move to the questions? Okay. We have a number of great questions coming in. So the first question is from Karsten, who's participating from Bamberg, Germany. He would like to know, first, thank you so much for participating in the panel. Do you have any advice on presenting the strength of computational social science to academic scholars from a subfield that are not very familiar with computational methods? So the example he provided was sociology. So this is a problem that I think many young computational social scientists faced, is many of the people who may be hiring them may not have as much experience with the techniques that they're using. And so how do you all approach that problem, and how do you recommend that other people approach that problem?
I'll start with trying to address that. And I think so. I think that if one way to address this question of making yourself relevant for a sort of for a sociology department or a discipline-specific department is to actually situate yourself within sort of some of the broader questions that department or that field is interested in asking, right? So if you're, for example, interested in studying social inequality, or if you're interested in studying discrimination, that's a very broad question that a sociology department might be interested in. And what your role there as a computational social scientist is to say that you're a social scientist who is really interested in this question substantively, and you're using a new set of methods or some innovative data that allows you to address this question in a way that is novel, but also perhaps could complement or augment existing understandings of that topic. And I think that's really the key, is that, you know, that I think there's often this kind of understanding that that we have in sort of conventional say sociology departments, that our computational social science is like purely is just it's only sort of methods or you know, people who are only interested in methods are doing computational social science. And I always encourage, or I always like to see myself as actually, well, I'm interested in the methods, but I'm also interested in the same kinds of questions you guys are. And I think that there are added advantages to maybe using this new kind of data. For example, you know, if you're using, say, digital trace data, it can help overcome some of the problems of, say, social desirability bias of more self-reported kind of measures. That could be one, just as an example of a motivation for why you might want to use this data source. So speak the same language, but also show how there are complementarities and strengths that you gain from adopting this approach. And say that, you know, this is what you bring to this community, and also say that, you know, and also it also helps to know the language. For example, in my case, I also know the language of survey research, and because I talk with people who work with survey data, so I know their language, so I see the strengths and opportunities offered by that too. Oh, sorry. But at the same time, I also want to make the case that it's not, you know, I see that strength, but I also see the weaknesses, and this is my opportunity to contribute to some of those weaknesses.
That's great. Thank you, Reedy. Does anyone else want to comment on this question about communicating with more senior colleagues who may not be as familiar with the techniques that we're using? Okay.
So something that we are experiencing in Finland is that quite many people are writing grant applications with buzzwords like big data or something like that. And of course, that's an easy venue for you to start selling yourself in, like use the need that they have, like they've written a grant application that they'll be doing big data analysis, but they don't have good skills in that domain, and that helps you to sort of navigate. But I agree with the idea that it's usually better to position within that field. Like my job title says computational social science, but that's the only place where it says computational social science. Otherwise, I speak myself as a human-computer interaction researcher or as a political scientist, depending a bit on the audience that I want. And that's also something that you might want to try, like computational social scientists can express themselves as data scientists to some audience, or as sociologists to some audience, depending on what the hiring people might need. Like if you go to computer scientists, say that you are the sociologist that they really want to hire, because then you stand out from all the computer scientists they have in their sort of job list. And it's like, oh, we have the sociologist who also knows our stuff.
Great. Thank you all. And thank you, Karsten, for that question. The next question is from someone from Chicago, from the Chicago site. This person thanks us for organizing the panel. And this question is about industry options for computational science, social science people who are not American citizens, but who are studying in the US. This person reports that recently rejected from a computational social science internship at a US tech company because of visa status. Is this a problem for non-citizens going forward for jobs as well? Is it different for nonprofit industry options? So anyone with experience about visa situation for people working in the US and how that varies by field or type of employer?
Well, I can tell you it definitely varies by type of employer. My knowledge of it is for people who are not US citizens, there's a sponsorship required that has a time frame and some significant costs related to it. And some of the organizations, when they're hiring, decide whether or not they're willing to go through those steps, go through the legal battle, pay for the costs, dependent on the availability of the kind of staff they're looking for. So there was a time a few years ago when finding people with genomics background and bioinformatics was really challenging. And so there was much more sponsorship. Organizations that needed those skills were much more willing to do sponsorship. So part of it is a supply and demand, for lack of better words. I know as far as I know, RTI being not-for-profit, it's absolutely no different than when I was at Data General. It was a matter of supply and demand and affordability and what made sense in terms of investment and return. So it's very much a business decision, and the factors of what you need to do to make sure as an organization you can get the work done you need to get done.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Let's move to the next question. Thank you for that question. The next question is from Jaron, who's participating at the Princeton site. He would like to know if we could compare jobs in universities, nonprofits, and governments from our own experiences in how they provide autonomy and opportunities for doing social good. So I think one way to think about this question is that different types of employers, different labor market sectors offer different combinations of compensation. Some of that compensation is in freedom, and some of it is in the ability to work in a mission-driven organization. Some of it is in compensation. So what do you all see as in broad strokes, the trade-offs between the different sectors?
I have a bit of experience working with government, and I guess I could say that generally speaking, the time frame of work is very different. Government needs solutions yesterday, whereas as researchers, we can often take 3, 4, 5 years to deliver solutions. And so one kind of key difference which kind of relates to autonomy in a funny way is that there's something of a trade-off between autonomy and social impact. The need for social impact requires some degree of social organization, which is a function of autonomy. So on the other hand, I think generally speaking, the opportunities for social impact as a junior person especially are potentially higher in government only because academia's incentive structure, particularly early on in your career, and especially at elite universities, though not exclusively at elite universities, tends to value and prioritize research over public impact. Some of that is changing, especially in certain state schools. There's discussions about using public impact as a criterion for both hiring and promotion or tenure decisions. But I think it's fair to say at the moment that's not a consensus view, even if it's an aspirational view.
So something that I would want to weigh in from an industry position or industry perspective is that industry has varied positions in terms of social impact and autonomy. So, for example, the position that I'm currently holding, and also the positions in Nokia, they were in the research development side, which is not actually that far from academia, except there's no pressure to publish stuff and other kind of things. Whereas then you could also go to industry and get more like engineering or data engineering, data science, like service function to other things. And of course, in there you have less autonomy. So this is also something that you can try to negotiate with the employer. Like this is the kind of position that I would want to hope. And thanks to the fact that these skills are in such demand, they might be actually willing to do really weird things to keep you happy.
Let me also just add that this can change across your career course. So after tenure, it's possible to redirect your efforts towards more public impact. So I imagine for most people in this conversation, you're interested about the junior level, but it's important to remember that tenure is an enormous gift in terms of autonomy that can not only define a research agenda, but also your public good mission.
Great. To follow up, Karen, you mentioned that at RTI, there's I believe you called it AI and Computational Social Science Initiative. Could you tell us a little bit about what that is and what the people there are doing? That would give, I think, some people a sense of some of the kinds of opportunities that are available outside of tech companies. I know Maddie talked a little bit about tech companies, but I think many people in the audience have less experience with non-tech companies.
So what's interesting, so RTI is a research organization. Within that, no, we're not labeled as a technology company, though we do technology work for clients, many of which are federal government agencies. And the work varies everything from very specific, say, policy research, all the way to implementing operational systems. And what we decided to do a while back was we often grow new capabilities by doing them working with our clients. So when we have a project with a client, they're interested in trying a new design to collecting data in a certain survey area. And so we would build a capability partially working in conjunction with that client. And we decided on the computational social science, the AI and machine learning, that while a lot of our clients are talking about embarking in those areas, they're not really there yet. And so we are doing an investment of RTI's own funds to increase this capability, create some tools, we call them reusable assets, do some knowledge graphs, some experimentation, and actually be out in front of when our clients are ready to utilize these types of things. So what we've done is put together a good-sized project of data scientists, infrastructure programmers, AI, machine learning experts, to come up with tools that apply to the kind of work we do. So a simple example might be if you have a large survey and you're collecting data on, in a field survey, you're collecting data on laptops or tablets, the data gets dumped into databases, and then over time, when you have enough of it and you meet your sample size, whatever, you start doing analytics. And so the analysis is doing programming in SICSS or SPSS, creating data sets, measuring error, measuring bias. Well, how much of that could AI potentially help with, either speeding up things or helping do much much better predictions with lower error if we're using new techniques. But you just don't hire somebody and say, go do new techniques. You have to have a way of creating the things, making it so the people who didn't create them can use them, and make it so the clients see value in them. We are also very much investing in a branding, for lack of better words, but also how do we bring our staff along? RTI is 5,000 employees. They're not all programmers, but they all work on projects. How do we make it so they understand enough about what we're trying to do and how we're doing it, so they utilize it for our, to meet our mission and deliver to our clients? It's a really, really exciting project.
Great. Thank you, Karen. So we have another question on the live stream. This is from Jay from Princeton. This is a follow-up to the question from Karsten earlier. So if my background is neither computer science nor statistics, but I have some experience with computational social science in my own research, teaching, and work experience, what's the best way to pitch myself for industry options? Conversely, if I'm trying to emphasize the value of computational social science to colleagues in my field, which in this case is political science, who are curious but not much enthusiastic, at least not yet, about computational methods, what's the best way to do it? So I think this really returns to a theme that Maddie talked about being able to describe yourself in different ways to different communities. So maybe if the panelists could describe some thoughts about how they do this or how they recommend other people do this, kind of explaining yourself to different people. I'll take this one for a second. So for example, this year when I was at the New York Times, I was a professor in residence, and one of my responsibilities there was to find projects to work on. So I spent a lot of time talking to people about what it is that I know how to do, in the hopes that we would find something together that would be interesting and important to them, interesting and important to me, and also possible to do. And one of the things that I like to say is computational social science is kind of a combination of social science and data science. So there are a lot of people here on the business side of the New York Times who do a lot of data analytics. And so I know how to do those things, but I also know how to do those things in a way that uses ideas from the social sciences to help make sure that we're answering the right questions. So this is not just a data engineering, which is by itself a huge problem, but that sometimes the ability to have the necessary technical background to be able to work in complex real data systems, and the necessary social science background to be able to understand what you are doing with that data, how that data links to questions. And so I guess one of the ways I like to think about it is, if the community that I'm talking to, I try to think about the things that they have less of. So when I was on the business side of the New York Times, they have already people that can run experiments. But I say, well, do you have people who think about mechanisms and how you design experiments to elicit mechanisms? And they're like, oh no, we have a lot of people who do A/B tests, but we have less experience with these other things. And likewise, when I talk to social scientists, they already have a lot of experience with designing experiments with mechanisms. So I talk about, well, do you have anyone with experience doing this in online platforms? And they're like, oh, that's different. So I think to the extent that you can emphasize different things and emphasize the things that the community that you're talking to is maybe less strong in, that's a chance for you to illustrate the kinds of complementarities that Reedy was talking about earlier.
One of the things whoops, sorry.
So if I continue with Matt's comments, or just to highlight that this is something that we also in academia need to do, because there's several communities of sociology or political science that I'm more familiar with, or human-computer interaction. Like there's the critical design school, there's the user-centered design school, and then you need to navigate the differences of those to make it clear that they understand what's your point and what you're bringing into those. And And based on many papers that I've written, it's often like tiny words that you use that might offset the whole thing and get your reviewers angry to you. And I would approach this as the same kind of problem, that there's existing communities in the business side or in organizations that want to do their own stuff. And you need to find out a way to express your ideas and thinking in a way that the reviewer too in the job board will say that, okay, like this is really good thing. I really like this one.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. Oh, Reedy, did you want to comment on that question? Okay, let's move on to the next question. Alex, who is participating from the Princeton location, how do jobs in different sectors and industries compare in terms of opportunities to continue building a research agenda and staying connected up to date in academic communities? Well, I can take, oh, go ahead, Maddie.
Staying up to date with the academic communities, I think that the biggest hurdle there is that in the university, someone else pays for the bill of all the journals that we need to follow and all of that stuff. And that's one of the pain points that I'm hitting actually in the industry situation. Like I can of course get the articles from my university thing, but I'm not that keen on doing that. So that's one of those really tricky things that I'm hoping that will be fixed later on or due to open access.
I would say, from my experience, one difference that I notice is that in people in university settings really seem to value advancing the state of the art. And that is often incredibly, incredibly expensive and time consuming. And people in governments and companies often prefer being at the state of the art, which is also quite difficult, but is not nearly as difficult as advancing the state of the art. And so in terms of building a research agenda and staying up to date, those things are much more valuable if you're trying to advance the state of the art. And so I think that's part of the reason that universities invest so much time in us being exposed to new things. So my department has a seminar every week. There are seminars all over campus all the time. If you think about the cost of that in terms of the faculty hours, it's incredibly expensive. What our expectation of spending lots and lots of time being connected and with what is at the bleeding edge in many fields. So I think if that kind of thing is enjoyable to you, then I think the university is really the place where you're going to find the most of that. But I do think that many companies, they want to be at the state of the art, and that too requires keeping up to date and getting exposed to lots of new ideas. And potentially sometimes I've seen at companies, people get exposed to a much wider range of new ideas. So they want to be at the state of the art. Like in sociology, for example, we have different subfields. And so someone might really be advancing the state of the art in one subfield. Whereas at a company, it might be more valuable for you to be at the state of the art in 10 subfields. So again, there's a trade-off. Some people really enjoy going into the deepest hole and getting a little bit more. And some people really enjoy having a wide range of exposure. And so I think that's one of the trade-offs. Chris?
I think part of Alex's question, as I understood it, is can you go back and forth between industry and academia? And I just wanted to share the experience of being someone on academic hiring committees and reviewing applicants from industry positions. And for a time, there was a real cachet to having industry experience because, even though I generally agree with Matt that the state of the art was, something that is defined in the university, in terms of methods, things like scalable methods for large data sets and things like that, that type of software was proprietary and developed in industry. So for some time, there was a real cachet of having those skills. And there was another development that shifted things considerably, which is the ability to publish in industry. I think has become significantly more constrained, at least at social media companies. And what very often happens when a group of academics reviews a file is they go straight to the publications part of the CV. Unfortunately, I'm not, that's not my own preference, but this is, to be honest, what happens. And so if there's a career gap 3 years after going into industry and there's no publications or no evidence of a publication in process, and then there's another candidate that has 3 or 4 that are completed and or in process, it's very hard for the industry person to communicate that they have, the equal potential to make an impact to the state of the art.
So one thing that I'd want to point out, I generally agree with everything that's been said. I will say that there are in industry organizations that are very much about pushing the state of the art. They are well funded. So, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and they're always, whether they're talking about it publicly or not, they are always trying to be out front. And then there are other industries, say automotive industry. So there, state of the art goes to a certain level, and then you decide where you're going to apply it. And you think about cars, where cars are now, where they were 20 years ago, where they're going to be 10 years from now. They're not necessarily staying at the state of the art. They're moving it forward in the context of changing transportation. And so I think it's not, I don't know about going back and forth. I can think of all kinds of ways that would be a challenge, but I wouldn't just write off industry as only utilizing what academia is providing, because there are firms that do gigantic investments in moving the state of the art forward. They just don't publicize it as much, which goes back to they may not be interested in supporting publications.
Agreed. Thank you, Karen.
This is just within the wider context of the discussion about industry versus academia, or industry and academia. And I think, one aspect of working in a university, and I speak as someone working in a university here, that is a real, I think, a bonus or a fun part of working in a university, other than just the research side, is that you really get to interact a lot with the kind of next generation, which I find can, even though, of course, as sort of a junior academic, often there's all this emphasis that you're supposed to put on your research, and that's really important. I think just being able to interact with sort of young people who have bright ideas, who are creative, who have a lot of energy, I find can be a very exciting part of working in a university. The fact that you're just sort of really getting to meet the next generation, regardless of what they're going to do. And I think for me, that's one aspect of being able to interact with that, with the next generation has been, I think, a key reason why I feel excited about working in a university as well. It's not just about my own research, but the fact that I can actually talk about and share my ideas with others, and also learn from them in this kind of collaborative way, and hear what they're talking about. I like that part, and I think that shouldn't be discounted.
Let me just chime in to say I absolutely agree with Riddhi. This is one of the main things I love about being a professor. But I also want to underscore that in job market conversations, with the exception of this one, it's so great we have people who aren't from academia here. We tend to have a kind of myopia around what the job market looks like. And we all know the academic job market is difficult. But, I think there's a grass is always greener phenomenon. You look over to industry and you think, oh, this, that, or the other looks better. But it's not so easy to get a job in industry. It's not so easy to get a job at Facebook. And I worry sometimes that we underemphasize the positives of academia. It's a wonderful, brilliant career in most every way that I can tell. Which isn't to say you couldn't have wonderful careers everywhere else, but just if you take a step back and you're familiar with the kind of obsession with the negative aspects of the job market, that's maybe because you're in an academic environment. Something to think about.
So if I can just add one more thing to this discussion, which is we haven't discussed the sort of industry side. So one of the great things, at least in Finnish industry, is that many Finnish companies actually are willing to support research, including financial support to research. And then you can sort of be setting the agenda a bit, and then the researchers are setting an agenda. These kind of collaborations that emerge, they are also, for industry people, one way of staying in the state of the art, or seeing where the state of the art is moving, because then they are like not only being really nice people who are paying our bills in the academia, but also really nice people in terms that we can discuss some of the things and try to find some application areas to the state of the art that we have from the research field or stuff like that. And it's an interesting shift actually from thinking like you've been doing the research and you move into a position where you might do less of the research, but you actually are most likely, like, everyone is so happy to see you and they actually value your time and come to the meetings that you set up, and you can send really weird emails at really weird hours. I've been doing that in my industry thing with some of the university collaborations that I have, and I'm like, if I would get this kind of email, I would be so mad as an academic, but they know me from academia, so I can do this kind of weird stuff.
Well, thank you, Maddie. Thank you, everyone. So actually, the next question actually builds on a lot of the themes that we just discussed in the previous question. This is a question from Tina, who's participating in Chicago. What are folks' thoughts about fluidity between computational social science related jobs in academia, industry, government, and the nonprofit sector? So we've been talking about sort of choosing one and staying in that. And I think this question really raises the issue of circulation. So maybe we don't have to think about these trade-offs. Maybe we can do some of one and some of the other. So the question continues, for example, are there more opportunities now for folks to move between jobs in different areas? Or are certain routes still largely one way? So any thoughts about moving between sectors? What kinds of directions are easier to move and what kinds of directions are harder? I can take this one. So I think in my own career, I've had a great chance to move between sectors some, and I find that to be wonderful. So in terms of moving from universities to other places, I think most universities offer some form of sabbatical, and this is a wonderful opportunity to spend a year in a completely different environment. So when I spent a year at Microsoft Research, I was exposed to a lot of new stuff, and it was wonderful. And I would say the same thing about the New York Times. And many universities also have summers where you are free to more or less go where you want. And so many universities also have an arrangement where you can do side projects 1 day a week. And so if your home base is at a university, I think there are many different ways for you to move into many other sectors and move back to the university while you sort of maintain the stability of having a full-time position at the university. So my experience has been in that direction. I don't know as much about other opportunities for other different directions of moving.
So there might be some differences depending on the discipline that you are in and then sort of the field that you are speaking in. So in computer science, to my understanding, the flow from academia to industry is quite easy flow. But also many of these big tech companies, they figure out that if they want to get the brightest minds, they need to allow them to publish. So they've sort of created the opportunity to keep them publishing, and therefore sort of jump from an industry position back to academia should be possible in principle, because you might have really interesting publications and then you can say that this is like the kind of stuff that we've been doing. But I don't know if this is as usual for sociology or political sciences or social science disciplines. In computer science, at least I feel that it's a bit more fluid.
So I just want to say something about the industry to academia possible trajectory. So I think Chris mentioned that as well. I do think that a big issue is how much you've published and how long you've been in industry. So I think if you were on a normal academic track and then you spent a few years in industry and you had a clear reason for why that happened and a clear reason for wanting to move back, I think that my guess is that would be doable. The longer that you are in industry, it becomes harder and harder to do the kinds of things that universities value. And so that is a challenge. I do also think one trajectory we haven't talked about is academia to industry to academia. And that, I think, if you are able to establish a track record in a university setting, and then you go into industry and you, for example, are not able to publish for a year or two, then I think you can potentially still come back and you can say, look at my track record from before. I've spent the last 2 years working on cutting edge problems. I was not allowed to publish, but I learned a lot. And when I come back to university and I'm allowed to publish again, you'll see the track record that I've built before will continue. So I think if you have enough of a track record in academic setting, it's easier to come back.
Just to underscore something that Maddie was alluding to earlier, I think there's a lot of variance across departments. So certainly in CS, like if you were in Bell Labs, for example, a lot of people came back to academia from those kind of top positions. But in social science, there's one other somewhat unique field, which is public policy, where particularly industry experience or government experience is valued. You might not come back as a tenured professor. You might have some kind of more adjunct role or professor of the practice, which means you have your contract is renewed every few years. But that's another pathway I've seen people come back from government or industry into academia quite a bit.
Great, thank you. We're getting close to the end of the panel. We have one more question, and then I thought maybe I would give all the panelists a minute to kind of provide any closing thoughts that they'd like to share. So the question that we have is from Bador, who's participating at the Princeton site. As computational social scientists, many of us tend to come from different backgrounds: computer science, informatics, social science, etc. If in the future you hopefully get hired in a tenure track position, but by a division or department that's different from yours or where you got most of your training, how do you think about the fairest way to evaluate the tenure of such a hire? So for example, imagine you have someone that's trained in computer science and gets hired into a sociology department. What do you think? What advice would you give to that person, or what do you think is the way to evaluate that person? Likewise, imagine if you had someone who's trained in a sociology department who gets a job in a computer science department. What are ways that that person can be successful, and how do we think are fair standards to apply to that person and his or her research?
Maybe I can take this one on because I've served on tenure committees for people in other disciplines and in kind of joint searches. The question of what is fair versus what happens is a very important distinction here. What would be fair is something where you had much more control over how the field is defined. But in practice, I think most folks on these committees would agree that one of the single most important things is the external letter writers in a tenure review process. So when you go up for tenure, you produce something very similar to the documents you might produce on the job market, some description of your research, a copy of your CV, but then you get letters, of course, written by anonymous people who are, usually leading figures in your field. And this is a very time-tested, tool that universities use to assess research excellence. And even if your department loves you and can see the unique value of what you do, if these letter writers do not, it creates a significant challenge for them in trying to communicate the value of you in the discipline that the university is considering promoting you in. So I think the safest way to think about it is to think about who your letter writers are going to be and to get as much clarity about that as soon as possible. Also, in certain cases, if you're being held to the standards of two different fields simultaneously, that's certainly something you want to think about as you go into the job, because it could define where you want to publish or which type of research you might want to publish. But early and often, I would recommend having conversations with senior colleagues where you ask for input about the direction of your research agenda. And I think other than that, it's just too much of a case-by-case basis to warrant a kind of generalization.
Great. Thank you, Chris. I think that's a great answer. and that mirrors a lot of what I've seen as well on these committees. So we've come to the end of our time now, and I want us all to take a minute on behalf of the participants and the people in learning from this live stream. I want to thank you all for participating. I want to see if anyone has any final thoughts that they'd like to add. This is our chance to share any wisdom that we've received from others, any experiences that we've had, anything anyone would like to say as a closing thought.
So one of the things that I talk to a lot of people looking for jobs, young people looking for jobs in these kind of fields. And we tend to always focus on how do I get a job that lets me use exactly these skills that I've developed that I want to use. And one of the things that I share with a lot of applicants is don't overlook the rest of the picture. So when you go to work in an organization, and again, I'm not an academic, but in industry or an organization like RTI, which is an institute, there are a whole lot of other aspects that matter. One, of course, is do you like what the organization is about? But from the hiring perspective, some of the other things we really look for include your communication skills. You know, can you speak? Can you write? Can you present? Can you present an idea to any kind of audience? Things like the ability to be effective on a team. Rarely do we hire people who get to go in a corner and do something fabulous all by themselves. And then there's the leadership skills. I don't mean becoming an administrative manager. I mean being able to be a thought leader and to push the science forward. And so I always encourage people to think about the rest of the picture when they're presenting themselves and when they're considering opportunities, and make sure all those things align well.
Great. Thank you, Karen.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Chris, go ahead.
Okay, Reedy?
Okay, so I guess my kind of closing thought, I have kind of two very general closing thoughts. And again, I speak this being an academic. First is that when you're applying for jobs in academia, especially, but also this is my experience, and also to some extent, this is probably true of any job. You know, you can be an excellent candidate, but ultimately your ability to get a job often comes down to this subjective notion of good fit. And I think I've now been on a number of hiring committees for different positions myself, and I found that this fit argument keeps coming up again and again and again, because often we're looking at very competitive CVs that could all do the job. So finding ways to kind of similarly to what Karen was saying, positioning yourself as a thought leader, or positioning yourself as someone who really speaks to and would be a good fit or a complement. A good fit doesn't mean that you're doing exactly the same thing in a department, but it just means that somehow you fit in because you share either some set of common ways of wanting to do research, or common ways of thinking about a problem. So just motivating yourself and situating yourself in the context that you're applying to, so that you can actually sell yourself as a good fit, is something that is really often important. And I recognize it's very subjective, but it's something that I think I never really understood fully until I've now come to the other side and I see it, that this is really just a very important thing to be able to. So that often means just knowing other people in the department, reading their work, figuring out what's going on there, trying to also speak that kind of common. The other kind of closing thought I have is that one of the nice things about being a part of a community such as computational social science is that it's still a very nascent or a burgeoning community, which means that as someone working in it, you also get to shape it. That means you also get to define what you think of as computational social science. And I think you should really leverage that, because you can say, I think this is computational social science, and this is why it's meaningful and valuable. And this is sort of setting and creating a new agenda, so to speak. And I think that, especially in a university setting, can be a positive thing. And being within a community that is still developing means that you get to shape it, and that's an exciting thing to really, I think, leverage and make the most of.
Great. Great. Thank you, Reedy. Chris?
Two really quick points. The first is we haven't talked a lot about logistics of the job search process. And I just want to underscore the need for preparation far before you look for a job, both inside academia and outside. And there's very different pathways and very different kind of, portfolios you need to assemble. But if you are a younger scholar, it's good for you to learn about those in your first few years of graduate school so you can set some goals for yourself. Second, to Riddhi's second point on the growing community, Matt, we should make a plug for our Facebook page, where Matt and I regularly post jobs that we get sent, ads for, so-and-so is looking for a computational social scientist. So if you're not yet a member of that group, I believe you have to ask for membership in the group, and I'm not sure who's the admin, but we'll figure it out. So it's the Summer Institute in Computational Social Science Facebook page, and that's what we've used instead of Slack for most job ads.
Yeah, so to follow up on that, you can contact your local organizer about joining that list. Also, if you have any job announcements that you want to share with that list, please send them to Chris or me, and we will share them with the community. Maddie, any closing thoughts?
And so maybe something that summarizes what everyone else has been saying is that you sort of, in this field, you create your own opportunities. And no matter how you are doing that, you really need to sort of shape stuff into the thing that you want to be, or the thing that you are. And sometimes it's a bit more brutal, sometimes it's easier, but you shape them.
Okay, and for me, I wanted to share two things. I guess one is a personal experience, and my experience being on the job market is incredibly stressful and incredibly difficult. And so if you are feeling stressed or isolated, everyone else is feeling stressed and isolated too when they're going through that process. And that there is absolutely an enormous amount of luck involved in how all of this turns out. The other is a piece of advice that my advisor gave to me, which is be yourself. So I remember I was spending a lot of time trying to think about what angles I could be positioning myself. And I was saying, oh, you can talk like this to these people and like this to these people. And he said, Matt, you should just be yourself. You're a fully baked version of yourself, and you're a half-baked version of all of these other people. And so just be yourself. And that allows you to put your best foot forward. And it also ensures that when you do get hired, those people are expecting you and not some other version of yourself. So I want to, again, thank all of the members of the panel, Maddie, Reedy, Karen, and Chris. This was really wonderful. I know that everyone watching the live stream really benefited. I want to thank everyone again for contributing your questions. That was very helpful. And that's it. Thank you all for participating in our first ever panel, multi-site panel at the Summer Institute in Computational Social Science. Bye, everyone.